I'm Chris Fedderson. I'm one of the volunteers here at Fort Ross.
I'm Warren Doyle, another volunteer here on the Windmill. Hi, and I'm Scott Foster. I'm also a volunteer here on the Windmill.
Scott, tell us why the windmill's here.
Well, when the Russians came here to first build the fort, the reason they built the fort here was so they could supply their other outposts up the coast with food and fish, and to the extent they could find them, sea otters. So, when they first got here, they knew they were going to need wheat because they could only bring so much wheat with them. So they started planting wheat. If there's one thing the Russians know how to do, it's grow wheat. So they were determined, and they started growing acres and acres and acres of wheat. The wheat they were growing looks like this, except this is pretty short. The actual wheat is about this tall when it's growing. It's a tall grass. The part of the wheat they're looking for are these little berries right here. They're called wheat berries. They look like little seeds. After they grew the wheat, they would go up into the mountains, into the hills back here, and cut it down with a big scythe. But when they cut it down, it was still pretty long. They had to bring it down here to separate this out. So the way they brought it down was they got big armloads and they piled it on animal skins because they didn't have plastic tarps. They piled it on animal skins and then dragged the animal skins down to this area where they had built a corral, about 100-foot diameter corral, not that big. They would pile the wheat, again it's about this long, they would pile the wheat in the corral till it was waist high to a man. And then they would round up all the horses they could find and put them in the corral and close the gate and start chasing the horses around in a circle. And they just whipped the horses, and the horses would run around, and they would stomp on the wheat and loosen all of the little wheat berries, and they would fall to the ground. What was left was the grass, and that was called the chaff. They would rake away all the wheat, and what was left on the ground were just the wheat berries and maybe whatever the horses left behind. They would sack the wheat up in a bag like this. But then they had to turn it into flour in order to make cookies and bread and that sort of thing. So the way they ground this when they were home was with a small home-sized mill with 2 stones. And they would grind their own wheat at home. And now Warren is going to demonstrate how they did that at home.
We have a kern over here. So why don't you come with me and we'll put some wheat in the kern. This is a smaller example of what this windmill does. In the windmill you have 2 large stones, and of course they're turned by the wind. Most homes, a couple of hundred years ago, would have a kern, and we've even had visitors here in the park from Russia who told me stories about, oh, when I go to Grandma's house for a holiday weekend, me and the rest of the kids would be sent to the kitchen to turn the kern. And that, if you'll look down in here, is grinding this wheat into flour. And the flour comes out the sides. You can see this is the hard way to make a loaf of bread.
When they came here in 1812, and they had probably a shipwright, a person that was good at woodworking, to make sure the ship made it to the United States. And then he was also probably in charge of building the fort, because he was a woodworker. After the fort was built, it was time to build this new modern machine that they had in Russia for grinding wheat. It was called a windmill. And the windmill was a pole windmill, which means that it's like a telephone pole. It goes to the ground right in the middle, goes all the way up, goes through the building, and goes all the way to the roof practically. So they dug a hole. It was 2 man deep, about 10 feet deep. And then they took this telephone pole, they burned it on a fire and charcoaled the bottom of the pole so that it wouldn't rot in the ground. Then they stuck it in the ground. and they made sure it was straight up and down, what we call plumb, this pole. This is the width of the pole here, and over here is the width of the pole there, so it's right smack in the middle. So they started by getting some rocks and making a foundation, and then they went ahead and put some charcoal on the rock, and then they laid a piece of wood on the charcoal rock, and then they turned the wood over, and any place there was charcoal on the wood, they carved away on it. And they would use some of the tools that you see here. They would use a chisel, they would use a mallet, and they would carve away, and they would make it fit the rock. So they used a thing like a compass, but it was called a scribe. It didn't have a pencil, it had two sharp points. And they would figure out how deep they would want that log to go into the one below it. So they would set this maybe for 3 or 4 inches. And then they would scribe on here the shape of the piece of wood that's going to go into it. And then they would get an axe, or they would make some saw cuts, and they would simply come in and notch it and clean it out with the chisel. And it would probably take them about an hour to make that joint. So if they started that day, there's 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and then they had lunch. And then eventually they had it all the way up to there, and then it was time to put the building on top of the pole. They used a different joint up there. They used a dovetail joint, and it locks it together. They wanted the building to be airtight and watertight, because that's where they're going to have all the important gears and the grinding stones. So that's held together with dovetails up there. Then they put on a giant set of spars. These are spars. And they put in blades. And they put the blades at a 16-degree angle. It's pretty amazing in a way, because it was really kind of the invention of the propeller. You know, the boats were all sailboats, so they knew how to harvest the wind for sailboats. But here's an example where they're harvesting the wind for making it into a machine that will grind wheat. So what we have up at the very top of the grinding stones, we have 2 giant wooden wheels. We can maybe take a picture of that later on to show it to you. And the next step is, if you're going to grind wheat for the day, is to have a windy day. And we have a windy day today, so we can see that. Normally they would want to figure out which way the wind's coming. So we would throw the grass up in the air, and we could see which way the wind's coming, and we see the wind's coming from that direction. So every windmill in the world turns. That way you can move it into the wind. One day it's the wind's here, the next day the wind's over there. So you have to be able to move the windmill into the wind. The way they make this ladder is they find a tree that had a curve in it, and they split it in half, put one half here and one half there. And then they can make the ladder. So it had this hook. It would automatically hold the ladder in place. So they didn't have to find 2 trees, they just found 1 tree that had the hook in it, and cut it down, and then split the tree in half. So right up here are the 2 grinding stones. And the person that was in charge of the windmill would always stay up here during the grinding process, because if the windmill started going too fast and it started grinding the wheat too quickly, it would burn the wheat. So the miller, the person in charge of the windmill, was always smelling the stones. He was keeping his nose to the grindstone to make sure the wheat didn't burn. And that turn, keeping your nose to the grindstone, started here in a windmill, because they were always checking to make sure the wheat wasn't burning or going too fast. So we put this right in here, and that will start feeding the wheat down into the grinding stones, and the gears would cause this wheel to go around and around.